to this real Britain fringe between the Mirror and Unite. It's on the fight for COVID justice. If you look at deaths on death certificates by doctors, more than 150,000 people have died. I think the government's guilty of delays and incompetence that piled the bodies up, as the Prime Minister said he was prepared to do, and they're now running scared of justice, because if they face a day of reckoning, we'll actually discover the grievous mistakes they made, which saw people die. And whatever sympathy the government people might have for the government in the initial part of the pandemic, most people died from the autumn onwards when the lessons were not learned. Anyway, that's enough from me, because I'm just chairing it. But Ros Wynne-Jones writes the Real Britain column in the Daily Mirror. And in many ways, I think, Ros, you are the heart of the Mirror.
Very kind. Yeah, I don't want to say too much today, because there's much more important people on this panel that we need to hear from. Thank you, as always, for having us here today, and to Unite for our long history of sharing events at this conference. Whatever the comings and goings of conference, it's really amazing to be back among so many friends and comrades and to see people again in person. And it's hard to take in how much has changed since we were last in Brighton at Labour conference in 2019. I think all of us are different. Many of us have lost loved ones. Many are traumatised by holding down key worker roles throughout the pandemic. Many have lost livelihoods. Some of us will never get over having to spend our mornings with Joe Wicks. And we know that the government wants to move on from the pandemic. Of course they do. They don't want to dwell on the mistake after mistake that they've made. They don't want to dwell on the fact that the UK had the biggest death toll in Europe and has suffered among the worst economic consequences. So no wonder it's pushing this vague inquiry that it's promised so far into the future it's barely visible among the long grass. The Conservative Party is so frightened of the families bereaved by COVID, they won't even allow them access to its conference next week. Despite his usual tendency to go around shaking hands with literally everybody, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has refused to see them 7 times. But the families represented here today by Matt and Hannah are welcome here, and they're more than welcome. And today's event is to let them know that we will never forget the 158,000 lives lost during the pandemic, all those still being lost every day, and we will fight for justice for them for as long as it takes. Matt and Hannah are 2 of the people behind the incredible, gut-wrenching COVID memorial wall in London, opposite Parliament. For those who've yet to visit, the real Red Wall, created entirely by hand-drawn hearts, is incredibly moving. And it's moving mainly because it reminds us that every single person who died during the COVID pandemic wasn't a number, they were a real person. When someone dies and no one will examine the truth behind that death, it heaps tragedy upon tragedy. Just as for the families of Hillsborough and the families of Grenfell, the bereaved families of the COVID pandemic cannot move forward with their grief while they know the truth is still being suppressed. They're trapped in the knowledge that something's gone very wrong and that no one wants to take responsibility, and no one is willing to learn the lessons to save future lives. Like the families of Hillsborough and the families of Grenfell, they know they're supposed to keep quiet and move on because ordinary people are always expected to shut up and pay the price. But like the Hillsborough and like the Grenfell families, they have no intention of doing so. We know and have known for well over a year now that it wasn't true that the virus didn't discriminate. It disproportionately affected Black and Asian people, working class people, poor people, women. And of course the economic fallout continues to disproportionately attack the same people all over again. The COVID risk was almost 4 times higher for the poorest people in England than for the richest, according to the Health Foundation charity. An analysis by Public Health England showed the coronavirus mortality rate was more than 3 times as high for Black men than other groups during the first wave. And it found that in Black and Asian communities, people were 2 to 3 times more likely to die. There are a myriad of reasons why this happened, from structural racism to health inequalities seen across our nation. But it was also because so many working class people are our key workers. Men like Hannah and Matt's dads, who kept the factories going so that others could stay safely at home. And both men were Unite members, by the way. These people were the backbone of our economy, a backbone that the government didn't see fit to protect. People like Hannah's nan, who's in a care home which only had a fictional ring of steel around it. They were the first people that we should have protected in the pandemic. According to the ONS, the highest death toll was found in the following professions: factory workers, security guards, care workers, bus drivers, healthcare assistants, chefs, construction workers, sales assistants, nurses, and social workers. Workers who were betrayed multiple times during the pandemic, betrayed by inadequate PPE in late lockdowns, thanks by hollow clapping that never translated into a pay rise, working in care homes, waiting the tables during dine out to die out. And we know that mistakes were made. The government locked down too late, not once but twice. It prioritised the economy over human beings. It was ill-prepared at every stage. Cobra meetings were missed. Test and trace was a failed outsourced obscenity. Elderly people were discharged untreated, untested from hospital into care homes. Face masks were mandatory for months. Schools were open and closed and never made safe. And our borders were left wide open to the virus. No wonder the government is kicking this inquiry so far down the road, it's nearly made it to Barnard Castle. And every kink of that can leaves us all in more danger. By not confronting the past, the government puts all of our futures into danger. We need the lessons to be learned, not in the distant future, but right now, so that we can save lives in the next wave of the pandemic or the next pandemic. The rapid review called for by the families could have intervened after the first wave and saved countless lives in the second wave, but it never happened. Are we really about to make the same mistake again? So that's why the Mirror and Unite have asked Matt and Hannah to lead this event for us this afternoon, so they can tell us the questions their loved ones still need and deserve to be answered, and so that we can offer them our unwavering support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ros. And as Ros said, we have two members of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice campaign. Matt Fowler, a Jaguar Land Rover engineer. He co-founded the campaign after his father Ian died in the first wave, and he drew the first heart on the COVID memorial wall, which alas is still continuing to grow. Matt, thank you.
Hiya. Firstly, I'd like to thank Real Britain at the Mirror and Unite the Union for inviting us down here, and for everybody else involved. It does mean a lot to us to have the opportunity to talk about our message and our experiences. And without the support of people who give us the podiums to speak from, people wouldn't hear what we were talking about anyway, and it wouldn't matter how good of a message or how eloquent of a speaker I could be if there was nobody there to listen to it. So you guys are all as important to this as I am, and I thank you very much for it. So I'm going to start off by saying I do find it a bit strange that I can say that some of you already know me, because as far as I'm concerned, I shouldn't be here. I am a slightly scruffy-looking car manufacturer from the Midlands. Yeah, there's at no point was public speaking any part of anything that I ever considered doing. And I'll apologise about that, because I'm definitely feeling a little bit self-conscious now. So to give you a sort of a little bit of background, my name is Matt. I co-founded the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice campaign at the end of April in 2020 as a result of COVID infection. He was in hospital for so hard, and I cannot fault them. They were, and in the we actually raised about £10,000 for the hospital in thanks. I have so much love and respect for the NHS and for everything they've done. Towards the end of his life, it became apparent that he had little to no chance of survival. And the hospital informed us that he had gone past the point they could help, and that they were making the decision to withdraw his life support, keep him sedated, and to let him pass peacefully. I think it was the right choice. I miss my dad incredibly. He was my hero. But if his passing freed, and I will stand by that. To talk about him a bit, he was only 56. He was quite a young guy. He had recently taken a voluntary redundancy from his job at Jaguar Land Rover as a design engineer. And he was spending his time with his dogs and renovating his garden. He was a very charismatic, very mischievous man who revelled in winding people up, pulling pranks. He was very much my inspiration, as I know people in the audience can attest. At only 5'4" thereabouts, he was the definition of larger than life. I've described him in, I think, just about every interview that I've done as the life and soul of every party, including the ones he wasn't actually invited to. The tragic thing about this is not my family's personal loss, but that we are in a club with the families of 158,000 other victims. And that's just it. After the initial catastrophic impact of COVID, we should have learned enough to prevent further deaths. However, our calls for public inquiry were largely ignored. Now, though the Prime Minister has committed to a statutory inquiry, after a lot of pressure from our group, it seems that it will be pushed further down, postponing the chance to implement the lessons learned until it is inevitably too late for an unpredictable number of people. That lack of urgency extends to the danger of pushing the inquiry years down the line, which will throw up additional obstacles in the same way that have been experienced by the survivors of Grenfell and Hillsborough. The thing about it is, these are people's lives. It's never too early to start saving them, but it is, and sadly has been, too late. One of the things that I've said, and I will continue to say, is that I would defy anybody to show me an inquiry and review that retroactively saves lives. The time to act is now. I mean, to be fair, the time to act was the summer last year when we first started calling for inquiry. But given that it didn't happen, what we should be looking to do is start at the earliest opportunity. I mean, our Scottish branch has been influential in making sure that Scotland have announced their public inquiry. That was incredible work by our Scottish team, and obviously we're so happy that somebody is leading the way. And by leading the way, people should be taking cues from them and following suit. It's quite shameful, in fact, that the same can't be said for the UK. So, right now what I'm saying is that we've got to all come together to put pressure on the government. And we need to gather all the people that are passionate about this, the people that have been influenced or affected, and all the people that haven't been influenced or affected that similarly believe in what we're doing. And we should all be looking to pool our resources and put on the right pressure to make sure that what we're asking for happens, and that is to bring our inquiry forwards. There are over 150,000 hearts on the memorial wall. It is a heartbreaking tribute to our loss. And it's soul-destroying to read new stories as people continue to join the group. I've said from the start that there's nothing I can do to bring my dad back. But if I can save lives going forward, I'm duty-bound to do it. One life might just be a statistic to government, a man in a suit in an office somewhere, but to that one life's loved ones, that could be their entire world. So what we really need to be doing now is getting together to save the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. You can't, as you say, bring your dad back, but it is inspiring you give him and others a voice, as Hannah does. Hannah Brady, training to be a teacher in Manchester. She's a spokesperson for the Bereaved Families for Justice group. She lost her dad, Sean, and her nan, Margaret, to the virus. Hannah.
Thank you. I'm here because in May 2020, I watched my kind, caring, hard-working dad die. He worked at Heinz in Wigan for 34 years and he was a union member his whole working life. Dad caught COVID on his way to work and spent almost 3 months in intensive care, on a ventilator, in a coma. He was only 55 and he never woke up. He never got to say goodbye to me. He did everything right. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and he went to the gym 3 or 4 times a week. He hadn't had a day off sick in 21 years until he caught COVID. The last phone call I ever had with my dad from a hospital bed was him giving me his HR department number, worrying that they'd think he was pulling a sickie, and he was in hospital fighting for his life. That's the sort of bloke he was. He was an amazing dad. He was looking forward to paying off his mortgage, going travelling, watching a lot more football, and COVID took that away from me. I'm here because in July 2020, we buried my wise, funny nan, Dad's mum. She caught COVID in her care home, like thousands of others, somewhere she should have been safe. Dad visited her 3 times a week until lockdown. We promised him on his deathbed that we'd look after her, and we failed. She was a proud Wiganer like Dad, a rugby-mad widow who'd beaten cancer and kept us all in line. I'm here because my loved ones' stories are only 2 of over 158,000 not being told. I'm here to push for the COVID inquiries, and I'm here because without union and Labour Party support, bereaved families like ours are going into this fight completely alone and completely ignored, and we need your help. We are 5,000 bereaved who know firsthand how wrong the government's response to the pandemic was, and still is. We saw the failures around care homes, hospital-acquired COVID, key worker deaths, late lockdowns, consistent lack of border controls, PPE shortages, U-turns in policy, blanket DNR orders, and the north-south divide in lockdowns and death rates. Because of this, despite asking 7 times since last May, the Prime Minister still has not met with us to look us in the eye, still hasn't listened to why we need the COVID inquiry. I asked our members how it felt to be completely ignored by the government. Elaine lost her husband, Christopher. She feels silence and indifference is destroying her. Susie lost her dad, and she feels like wanting answers makes her the wrong sort of bereaved person. We feel let down, alienated, betrayed, isolated, tired, and like our loved ones' lives were worthless. We've taken up this fight, but these inquiries are not just for the bereaved. They're for anybody who lost a job in the pandemic and has been rehired on a lower wage, someone who lost a loved one because they couldn't get a hospital bed, anyone stuck on an NHS waiting list, who struggled to homeschool their kids or suffered mental health problems because of prolonged late lockdowns. Everybody in the UK deserves to know why they were subjected to a mishandled pandemic. The COVID inquiries are the only way to get those answers, and we need your help to make them happen. Unite and the TUC have been a great source of strength and support for the campaign, and we're grateful that they're fighting on our behalf. On International Workers' Memorial Day, I met with union leaders at the memorial wall. They took the time to get to know me, and through me, Dad. Dad was one of you. He was a working-class northern bloke who always paid his subs on time, but he also paid the price of being a key worker in an area of the country that Westminster does not care about. He was 17% more likely to die than someone in the south. How can this still be happening in 2021? How many members of the movement lost a loved one to COVID-19? How many members lost loved ones to the virus? Our fights are the same fights, and we thank you for having us with us today. Senior figures in Labour, like my Mayor, Andy Burnham, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, have supported our call for the inquiry since summer 2020, and they have our thanks. MPs like Jack Dromey and Afzal Khan are incredibly supportive and active in our campaign, and we thank them too. But they are a minority of Labour MPs who do what they can to hold this government to account. I should not have to comfort my members when they write to their Labour MP about their lost loved one, asking for support for the public inquiry, only to be ignored. A response is the least that they deserve. We already feel abandoned by the government. We need Labour to hold themselves to a higher standard than the Conservatives. Key workers, union members, red wall voters like my dad were sent to the slaughter to keep this country alive. The thanks my dad deserves is for his family to know why he died and what is actually being done to prevent others like him dying unnecessarily. More than that, unbelievably, we have a Labour First Minister of Wales who refuses to announce the divorced Welsh inquiry. Our Scottish families have successfully secured an inquiry in Scotland. Shamefully, our Welsh families can't even get a response to letters that they send Mark Drakeford. The only other party leader to do that has been Boris Johnson, and that is not good company to keep for a Labour First Minister. We need Labour support for the COVID inquiries to be consistent across the board. If you think you deserve answers over the handle of the pandemic and want to do something about it, there are things you can do to help us. Our petition has over 250,000 signatures, and adding your voice can make sure that you are heard. Similarly, writing to your MP to bring forward the inquiry is key. Our crowdfunder ensures we can carry on this fight for years to come. We've also created, maintained, and we protect the National Cobra Memorial Wall, which is over 157,000 hand-painted red hearts opposite Westminster. So we want the MPs to look at the sea of love we've created and know the cost of denying COVID inquiries. The government have no intention of making that memorial permanent, and so we fund that too. Finally, I'm speaking now to anybody watching or in this room who lost a loved one to COVID-19. Families in our group know what you've gone through, and we'll make sure that you're not alone anymore. Join our group via Facebook or email. Members like Callum and Caris say a meal that makes them feel supported, understood and cared for. Alejandra lost her mum to COVID, but now she feels like she is her mum's voice. Rebecca feels validated and affirmed. One member said we saved his life. We are 5,000 bereaved families in a safe space with links to free bereavement counselling, legal representation in the inquiries, COVID memorials and local support networks. Join our group, join our supporters at Labour and Unite, and join our fight.
Thank you, Hannah. You're a very strong, articulate voice. And if those in London or Cardiff think you're going to go away, they're making a big mistake. Andy Burnham is Mayor of Great Minister in the government, and during the battles with the government over support for areas being hurt by COVID lockdowns, you were called the King of the North, weren't you? You never know, you might be King of the South someday as well. Andy Burnham.
Thanks. Shall I wear the crown? I'll leave it there. I think I'm going to start by, if I can, speak on behalf of everybody in the room in saluting the courage of Matt and Hannah, speaking so powerfully for thousands of other families out there. That's what you're doing today. Families who basically have been lost in the same way you've probably felt lost over the last year or more. So, you're here, you're speaking for people. Really, we're proud of you for doing that, and well done for doing that. You have the support of everybody in the room. I also just want to thank you, Ros, because your coverage is brilliant. I mean, the way you write about things that other journalists don't write about, and the paper gives you the space to do that. So well done to the Mirror too. Your Real Britain campaign coverage is something that we all draw. I personally draw a lot from. And I remember you writing, I think you were talking about Hannah's story, Hannah's family story, about two pandemics. And that's very much where I want to start today. I think we have seen two Britons basically kind of revealed. The inequality that we've got has been very starkly revealed. If you go back to last year, one Briton was at home on Zoom, or sitting in the garden, or going for their daily walk. But there was another Briton that never stayed at home, not at any one point at all. We're out at work all the way through, but we're going into workplaces without PPE in some instances. We're going into workplaces that were unsafe because I don't believe the health and safety executive did enough personally to ensure the safety of workplaces that people were sent into. And there were many, many people in a terrible position where they may have felt unwell, or they may have been asked to isolate, but were unable to do so because they knew that would have meant no food on the table, or the family going into a debt crisis. And they were then faced with those dilemmas, and often no choice but to stay in the workplace. That was the reality of last year. And it's kind of where we need to focus this and get justice for the people who were in those impossible positions. Now, I'm just going to say at the start that there can't be a perfect response to a pandemic. So I suppose I'm fairly well qualified to speak about this because I'm probably the only health secretary alive that dealt with a pandemic, a much milder one. But nevertheless, at the beginning of swine flu in 2009, no one knew what it was going to be. And obviously, because of that experience, I had knowledge of the pandemic planning that had gone on in the Department of Health and the policy framework that decisions were meant to be taken in. And let me say at the start, I made mistakes in that swine flu pandemic. Kevin might remember once when I stood up in Parliament and I gave the figure out for the worst case scenario death toll. And I almost remember the gasps around from people, and I kind of realised then I probably shouldn't have done it, but I was trying to be open and not hide anything from people. And it was hard, sort of balancing the openness with not alarming the public. And probably on that occasion I got the judgment wrong. As I say, there can't be a perfect response. And it was after that I said, going forward, I agreed with the then Chief Medical Officer, Liam Donaldson, that he would front the main briefings because it would be better if they were not kind of led by politicians. And the reason I'm kind of mentioning all of that is because that experience was very much in my mind when I saw everything unfolding last year. And I do think I can be of a help to you both and all the other families in getting the answers that you really must get. And we will get them for you. But I think in also kind of supporting your call for the public inquiry starting now, I think for all of us, everyone who lives in this country needs it, because it will reveal how our country is run. And I think what you will have seen over that pandemic is kind of the worst traits of that Whitehall and Westminster system concentrated, and were really then decisions taken in that climate in which decisions are taken there that often turn out to be the wrong decisions. I'll give you an early example which made me think that things were going wrong. It was in February, I think, or early March last year, where the then Health Secretary had briefed an important piece of public information about the pandemic and the way it was developing and what people should do behind a paywall to a trusted newspaper, the Daily Telegraph in this case. And I remember kind of going public about it that day, went mad about it, saying, how can you be putting information during a pandemic out behind a paywall? And I made a call then saying there should be a daily briefing like we had during swine flu, and it should be led by the clinicians, not by the politicians. And they did half of it, because the daily briefing, but they never did the other bit. It was always politician-led, and I personally think that was the wrong judgment. It should have been much more led by independent advice. So that was the kind of first sense that things was going on. Then, if you go forward a few weeks from there, I remember another weekend being inundated with kind of messages from GPs across Greater Manchester who were in a high state of distress, it's got to be said, saying that the cases are just going wild, and we're seeing queues of cars on the beaches at Formby, and people were just enjoying the sun, and this can't carry on. And then, there was a clamour that a few of us started around stay at home, and that was even before the government even talked about it. And if you remember how that happened, they were almost forced into that decision on Monday, the 23rd of March, I think the date was. But it wasn't a decision that they planned for. They were forced into that decision. If they'd been left to their own devices, I think that decision would have come much later than it actually did. We, joined here by Steve Rotherham in the audience, once that stay-at-home request had happened and the country had gone into that different position, we then spent the next month, I think, receiving thousands of emails from Steve's members, other union members, people from all over the country, actually, who said their workplaces were unsafe. And this, again, reveals, I think, one of the flaws of our way our country's governed. You know, rushed regulations that were more, I think, business-friendly than they should have been. There was a part of the regulations that talked about 2-meter distancing should be observed where possible. But that was just a signal to the businesses to say, well, you don't really have to do it. And as far as I could see, the health and safety executive weren't active in that period. And Steve and I were dealing with these real concerns from people. Imagine yourself, put yourself in the position of somebody in a workplace where you're worried because you've got a vulnerable family member. It was really completely unacceptable, but that was going on massively in the early part of last year. We were also, I think, overwhelmed with the response by our directors of public health when we first got wind that the test and trace system was going to be outsourced. That caused general astonishment in the public health community, because already there were teams in place to pick up the testing work and the tracing, but those teams were stood down, the testing teams, in February of last year. And when the decision came to outsource the tracing, none of them could make any sense of it at all, and there was general disbelief in the public health community about that decision. I mean, all of these things were happening, and there just didn't seem to be any logic. Knowing as I did the pandemic policy framework, none of this made any sense to the people that I was talking to at that time. So you could see how this was building, and then you come to the bit that Kevin mentioned, where we got to the summer of last year when we went under restrictions in Greater Manchester. After Leicester, we were the first big area to go under local restrictions. And then the debate about Tier 3, which Steve and I went through this time last year. I mean, it was just an unbelievable state of affairs where they were briefing newspapers that pubs across the north were going to shut before they'd even picked up the phone to us. And we started to say, well, if you are going to do that, you have to support people whose workplaces are about to be closed down. And the reason why we were worried was they'd shut all hospitality in Bolton in September last year without a single penny of compensation for any of the owners of those businesses, no wages paid for the people who worked there. So we were alarmed and we were worried about where the Tier 3 thing was going, and hence we started to call for financial support. It wasn't even on the table at the time. And we began, you might remember, this internal argument with the government. But in the end, why it came to what it did was because they just would not agree to an 80% furlough for the people in the pubs and the betting shops and the other places that were being told that they had no work to go to. And we were saying, how can that possibly be right? How can they be worth 67% of their wages, but everyone else who's at home on furlough is worth 80% of their wages? And bear in mind, 60% of the earnings of somebody who works in a pub are a lot harder to live on than 67% of the wages of somebody who works in an office. But none of this was being taken on board, and you might remember how that came to fruition. And it was only when London went into Tier 2 that the whole argument changed and the support was suddenly on the table. So what I'm just trying to get through here is you can see the age-old flaws of the Whitehall and Westminster system here, briefing certain headlines to certain newspapers to curry favour with those newspapers. Running a pandemic in that way, completely wrong in my view. Outsourcing and privatising rather than localising, which is what they should have done. Let me be absolutely clear about that. They should have localised the pandemic response, but they didn't. They bypassed local government, and that's another trait of the Whitehall and Westminster system, this distrust of local government, just ignore it as an irrelevant. They did it. If they'd have worked through local government, the pandemic response, I can tell you to you both, would have been much better. And my teams in Greater Manchester, Steve's and Liverpool, actually fixed the tracing system for them because it still wasn't working, even towards the back end of last year. And they, in the end, had to ask us to come in to help sort it out. But these are the kind of things that a public inquiry needs to get beneath and look at the decision-making papers so that you can get those answers that you deserve. But then that final thing, the North, just an irrelevance to that. You know, nobody listening. When I said to the Prime Minister on the phone that we've been under restrictions since July and they were trying to put us under more, I don't think there was an understanding that even acknowledged that we had been under those restrictions. And there was certainly no compensation on the table at any point up until October. And I just don't think there was any recognition of how hard, how much people were suffering out there. And still are, actually. No recognition at all. We were also trying to speak for the excluded, all of those people who never even got any public support. But that issue was just brushed aside. No, not interested. Self-employed, freelance, doesn't matter. You know, nothing. So, all of these things, but of course, that complete ignoring of the north of England, you saw that come out really clearly. So I'll conclude, Kevin, by saying, you know, I am here, we are here to support you in making this call. As I say, no one can say that their pandemic response is perfect. I initiated an inquiry into the swine flu pandemic, and it's got to be right that this is done and done now, because the value of what comes out of it will be stronger the earlier that it's done. And I remember that the Taylor inquiry into Hillsborough was done immediately after the Hillsborough disaster because of the safety implications for other football grounds. Within a couple of months it was completed. There's no reason at all why this can't start now and can begin to produce answers that may support people. But we would just put a little word of warning down. I've mentioned Steve being here. Obviously we worked together on the Hillsborough campaign. And I just would ask you not to underestimate the scale of kind of blocking that you will get from the system. I think you probably already have a sense of that. But it will be moving that Whitehall machine. It takes some doing. Look at those poor families affected by contaminated blood. They're only now in a public inquiry. And that took place in the late 70s, early 1980s, and they still haven't got the answers that they deserve. And that should obviously tell you what you are up against. I see the name Orgreave at the back of the room, and Steve and I very, very much said after Hillsborough and the role of the South Yorkshire Police in what happened there, that Orgreave, if you wanted to understand Hillsborough, you should also look at Orgreave. And we said the full truth needed to be told about Orgreave, because actually what happened there was the blame was shifted to miners 5 years before Hillsborough, in exactly the way that the blame was later shifted to the Liverpool supporters. 96 miners, the same number actually, the 96 miners were put on trial in a trial that collapsed instantly because of fabricated police statements. Does that ring a bell about what happened 5 years later? But I discovered this summer, I was, believe it or not, on my summer holidays, and I picked up a book called Diary of an Put it down in a strange way. This is, for those who've not read it, this is a Tory wife called Sasha Swire, who certainly does live the high life and doesn't hold back. It's kind of an interesting and quite revealing read, because it does reveal how this country is run and how the other half that are running the country, how they are living. And honestly, if you read it, you will understand why the dysfunctional decisions are made left, right, and centre. But one of the things she says in the book, she has a diary entry where she's talking to Amber Rudd about Amber Rudd having come into the Home Office and inherited inquiries that were ongoing, and how she was very frustrated and annoyed about this. And this is the first time I've ever seen it in black and white, first time I've spoken about it publicly. In that book, there is just one sentence that says, Amber told me that she wasn't going to proceed with an Orgreave inquiry because it might tarnish Margaret's legacy. That's what it says. We suspected it at the time. Officially in the House of Commons, she said, we wouldn't have an inquiry to Orgreave because nobody died. That's what she said. Actually, behind closed doors, it was about Margaret's legacy being tarnished, and that's why it was blocked, and that's why everybody needs to continue to support the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign as well, because that will tell you something about how this country is run. But so will the public inquiry for the getting answers for families bereaved by COVID-19. It will tell you about ministers too close to the private sector, ministers too close to newspapers. It will tell you about local government being completely disregarded, ridden roughshod over. It will tell you about the north of England crying out for help, being absolutely brushed aside. It will tell you all of the things that are wrong with the way this country is run. And what I would say now, from where I am looking at this, from the position that I am in, Britain needs to be completely rewired, completely rewired. There needs to be much more power taken out of Westminster and Whitehall and given to people at the local level so that the pandemic response could have been run properly from that local level. Complete devolution, as far as it can go, in my view, is where we should go. Reform of the House of Lords, so it's not those same people connected to those newspapers and those companies in that place, but it's a proper Senate of the nations and regions. And I would say reform of the House of Commons as well. The country needs to be rewired if we're not to see contaminated blood. Hillsborough, Orgreave, Grenfell. I mean, how many more times is this going to happen? And then we say, oh, well, another one. Well, why is there another one? Because the country is not set up in the interests of ordinary people. Steve and I have seen it. The scales of justice are not even. If you talk about levelling up, you should start there, because ordinary bereaved families walk into courtrooms in this country with the odds completely stacked against them. They have no hope whatsoever when they come into courtrooms and they are facing police services or other public services who've hired the best QCs in the land at great public expense. And often those bereaved families are walking in raw with grief, but with absolutely nothing, because they don't get their legal fees paid. And that's why we keep saying there needs to be a Hillsborough law in this country that gives families bereaved, where the state has been at fault or is involved, equal funding, parity of funding at those inquests, so that the full truth can be told, rather than the authorities, with all the power, start to create a version of the truth that suits them, and then you have bereaved families fighting for years and years and years and years in the wilderness outside. It's because of the way the country is run. The country needs to be rewired. We support you, Matt, we support you, Hannah, and everyone else in this campaign, but actually we support you for a bigger reason as well, because it will reveal everything that's wrong with this country and why real change is needed. Thanks very much indeed for listening.
And Andy's too modest to say that he had threatened to resign as a cabinet minister to get the Hillsborough panel set up, which got to the truth. And I don't think this Conservative regime is going to give up its dirty secrets easily. There's no minister threatening to resign over COVID, sadly. Dr. Sonia Adesara is a campaigning medic working in general practice at the moment, has been in acute London hospitals in the past, and knows the truth on the front line when there were no PPE shortages, we were told, in the NHS. Well, I think you saw it very differently.
Firstly, I think I just want to reiterate what Andy Burnham said. Hannah and Matt, thank you, God, so much for your strength and your courage and your persistence to fight for justice, not just for your families, but for so many other families across the country, so thank you. So I recall a shift when I was working in the hospital, and we were just overwhelmed with the numbers of COVID patients coming in. Our oxygen alarms were constantly going off. We had 2, sometimes 4 people in A&E cubicles that were meant for one person. And it was towards the end of my shift, and this lady came in. She was in her early 60s, and she was just clearly very sick. And in normal circumstances, she would have gone straight to the resus department, where she could have been put on a monitor, have one nurse looking after her, have one-to-one care. And then over the next hour, she was just getting more sick. Her blood pressure was going down, her oxygen levels were going down, so I called ITU. But we only had one ITU bed left, and we had 3 other patients in the hospital who were more sick than her. So this lady was left in a A&E cubicle in a loud, overrun A&E department with one nurse trying to care for her whilst looking after, I think it was about 6, 7 other patients. And the next day, when I came in, I found out that she had been found dead in that cubicle. Now, I don't know what she died from, and I don't know if circumstances had been different, could her death have been prevented? But I shouldn't have to ask that question. Now, I've been a doctor for many years. I've seen lots of sickness, I've seen many deaths, but what I have personally found really difficult over the past 18 months is knowing that many of the deaths that I was seeing could have been prevented. And the truth is, we will never know that number. We will never know the number of deaths that could have been prevented. But what we do know, and what I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say this, that the government's response to this pandemic has been reckless and careless. And I guess maybe someone more forgiving than me could excuse the government for the being so unprepared and their litany of mistakes that were made at the start of this pandemic. But the shift that I just told you about, that shift happened at the start of this year. And the sheer arrogance of this government to not learn, to not reflect, and to repeat the same deadly mistakes is unforgivable. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that health workers, we are not robots. And as others have said, there were many times during the pandemic when we were working knowing that we didn't have adequate protection. Many of my colleagues were on the front line knowing that they themselves or their family members were more vulnerable to dying. And we also lost colleagues. So one of the GPs who was working in my A&E department, he died in our ITU. And I was told, I wasn't there, but I was told that some of the staff who were trying to resuscitate him, many of them were crying whilst doing so. And those staff would have come in the next day and the next day. They've had no time to process, no time to reflect, because the pressures have been unrelenting. There has been no summer break for NHS workers, because the pressures have been kept going, and we've been dealing with this massive backlog. And the government's response to NHS workers with their pitiful pay offer is an utter disgrace, and I really hope to see all the unions and the Labour Party making a stronger stand for workers. Now, finally, this is the context in which we're going into winter. And yes, we are very fortunate that the population is, well, on the whole, the population is vaccinated, but we're not in a good position. And the reason why the NHS became so quickly overwhelmed in the first wave and in the second wave is because for many years now, the NHS has been running with very little to no spare capacity. So just last week, my local hospital went into black alert, so that means they had no free beds. So it won't take much, just a small increase in admissions, whether it's from a new variant, from a flu outbreak, for the hospitals to again become very quickly overwhelmed. And again, the government are ignoring warnings from frontline workers. And the consequences of their recklessness and their arrogance is lives. It's unnecessary lives lost. And remember, one life lost is another family like Matt's, like Hannah's, who is left heartbroken and destroyed. And I think it's unforgivable. and we do need to hold this government to account.
Thank you, Sonia. And it kind of sticks in the throat every time you see pictures of Boris Johnson applauding health workers, and then he doesn't reward them later on. Applause is cheap and hypocritical in his case. Steve Turner's United Assistant General Secretary, started out as a bus conductor, spent his entire life campaigning for justice for workers, and that now includes those who've been victims of COVID. Steve.
Colleagues, how do you follow that? I've been to a lot of fringes that have been put on by Real Britain, and I'm incredibly proud of our union and the role that we play in supporting Real Britain, and I'm proud of the way that the paper, the Mirror, Kevin, Ros, what you do in bringing to life real stories, emotional stories that reflect the true experiences, the life experiences of people across our communities, whether that's fringes I've been to dealing with universal credit cuts and some of the most vulnerable and exposed people in our communities, or to a fringe. I don't think I've been to a fringe that's been more emotional than this. I think if the stories of Matt and Hannah didn't bring a tear to your eyes, and the experiences of Sonia and the heroic way in which our NHS staff, our key workers actually, all of our key workers have stood up during this pandemic and put their own lives on the line in order to save ours, and lost too many friends and comrades on that journey, that I think we're all in the wrong place. You know, this is an incredibly moving experience for me personally. But I had an opportunity to speak to Matt and Hannah before, and there's a bigger story behind your story. You know, you didn't just lose your dads and a friend and a comrade and somebody that you stood up to and you looked up to. You know, the experience, the strength and the resilience that you've demonstrated in picking yourselves up and telling this story, coming to meetings like this across all of our nations, actually, building that campaign to bring justice to the 158,000 victims of COVID, the 4.8 million globally that have lost their lives, all of those that continue to suffer from long COVID, and we won't know the consequences of that, of course, for many, many years, and nor will they personally in so many cases. I think that's heroic. And I just want to place on record our thanks, our sincere thanks to you for everything personally that you do in the work of building that campaign. You know, and you've suffered as a result of that. It's not just about the losses. You told us earlier about you not being able to visit. Not being able to visit your dads. I mean, and hundreds of thousands of people have been in this same place. Not being able to say goodbye. Not being able to bury with dignity. Not being able to have a proper funeral, and yet, you know, I don't want to embarrass you, but hundreds of people came out on the streets.
Yeah, my dad was hugely popular.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of people came out on the streets to say goodbye to your dad, even though you couldn't have a funeral. And that's incredibly moving. And you stand up now, and you stand up because you want justice. You want to see people treated with respect and with dignity. And that's incredibly powerful, and I'm really proud to have tried to play my part inside the TUC, more so inside Unite, of course, to support everything that you do. The Memorial Wall, anyone that's not been to London, if you get a chance and you're in London, then do walk the Memorial Wall. It's an incredibly moving experience. Over 150,000 individual hearts, messages, emotional outpouring. Writing on that wall is just incredible. And the campaign to make that a permanent fixture, to protect it, to protect those messages, to make that a memorial really for those that have lost their lives to COVID, is incredibly important. And that's a powerful message, right opposite Westminster, where so many of the failings occurred, of course. And to hold them to account for that in a permanent structural way is really, really important. And anything that we can do to help you to make that happen, we will do. Believe me, absolutely, we will do. The inquiry, the demand for an inquiry now to expose the failings of government, and there have been many, and Andy's outlined them, you know, in terms of not just looking back on his own experiences as a health secretary and the lessons that he learned, but of course they've not learned any lessons, and we've gone from failure after failure. after failure. I remember very early on when we had problems with personal protective equipment, we couldn't get supplies, even into a health service, let alone our workplaces. We work with our supply chains. I work personally, I'm responsible for manufacturing in our union. And I made contacts right through our supply chains with huge global companies to find PPE for our NHS. I sent details to the Cabinet Office who was coordinating this, outsourced to Price Waterhouse, of deals that could be done to get PPE into our NHS. And weeks later, I was contacted again for details of who they should contact. And of course, those deals were then gone. They'd been lost, and we lost opportunities to provide personal protective equipment. We launched the ventilator challenge because we didn't have enough ventilators in our National Health Service. And we did that not just to provide ventilators for our hospitals here in the UK, but to provide those ventilators wherever they were needed, anywhere around the globe, actually. And that was incredibly important. And that was despite the obstacles that were put in the path of that challenge by government. It was business itself that came together with the ventilator challenge. It was industry. It was Catherine Bennett at Airbus. It was JLR. It was Ford Motor Company. It was Airbus itself. Workers, thousands of working people, came back from furlough and volunteered to work in closed environments to manufacture ventilators and personal protective equipment to keep our people safe. And there are lessons to be learnt from that. And the failures of government around that need to be learned. We had lockdown, we had school closures and openings, we had, the failure of test and trace. Andy referenced it himself, billions of pounds being spent, given to mates, really. Local landlords of pubs, friends and family, all sorts of exploitative arrangements put in place with taxpayers' money being handed over to the already rich, in many cases, of course, in order to profit from a pandemic. This is obscene, what's been going on, and the exposure of that is incredibly important to us. We've been fighting, we put proposals forward very early on to have roving health and safety reps. I pay tribute to all of our health and safety reps in workplaces, our union's health and safety reps, not just Unite's, our movement's reps, who are incredibly professional, who spent day after day after day in workplaces working on engineering controls to make sure that workers were safe, that were continuing to work. And hundreds of thousands of our members, millions of working people, continue to work right through this pandemic. And largely they work safely because of the work that have been done by our trade union movement and our health and safety reps. And we made proposals for the government to enable roving safety reps so that our reps could leave their workplaces and work with others in the supply chain and other areas where they weren't unionised. Not to grow our union, to do the right thing, actually. To share our knowledge and our experience and to give employers and workers an opportunity to build safe places of work. And that was denied and denied and denied, and we got no ability to be able to do that other than working with good companies who agreed with their supply chain to allow their reps to go out and to improve the conditions in those workplaces. And that's incredibly important that we did that. And then, of course, it's not just about what we're doing now, it's about vaccines. And we had a conversation earlier about vaccines. While we're vaccinated here in the UK, we're relatively lucky to be in a position to be vaccinated. Go to Africa and about 2% of the population is vaccinated. We're having arguments now about the profit that's being made on vaccines in the global south, South America and elsewhere, rather than vaccines being made freely available as a gesture of humanity, actually, to enable the world. This is a global problem. This is not a vacuum around our island. This is a global problem and requires global solutions. And we did a deal with AstraZeneca, the only UK company actually to produce a vaccine and the only one to offer it at cost price. The only one to offer it at cost price. $1.27 for a AstraZeneca vaccine, over $24 for a Mondial US vaccine on a free market. How exploitative is that vaccines that save lives are now being used as an opportunity to maximise profit for pharmaceutical companies, much of which the research was funded by the states themselves. The states themselves. So there are huge lessons to learn out of this. So again, anything that we can do to support the call for that independent inquiry, to make sure that a proper chair is allocated to that, to make sure that the terms of reference are really clear and they can't be abused like they have been in so many other inquiries that have taken year after year after year. I mean, the Shrewsbury 24, Orgreave, Grenfell. Grenfell's still going on. Now, we've got example after example of the state closing ranks and refusing to allow a proper, true, independent investigation of their own activities during the course of crisis. And we need to stop that. So again, anything that we can do on that front to help you, we'd be absolutely delighted to be able to do. So just a call to everyone in this room. It's a pity more people ain't in this room, to be honest with you. This is a story that should have been heard by the conference. I don't know about just in a fringe meeting, because there are so many lessons that come out of this. But do get involved in the campaign. Do sign the petitions. Do get hold of your MP. Don't just send a letter to your MP. Go knock on the door of your MP. Get into that surgery. Get your face into their face and have a personal one-to-one, eyeball-to-eyeball conversation about why they ain't supporting an independent inquiry and an independent inquiry now, why they haven't signed the petition, why they aren't supporting the campaign. And let's get this thing moving, because if it doesn't move, the inertia of the state will kick in, just as they have done in so many other examples that have been spread today. So look, I'm honoured to share a platform with so many great people, actually. I think this has been a wonderful fringe. I think it's a fantastic panel. We're incredibly proud to work with Ros and Kevin and the team at the Mirror to enable these things to happen. And anything that we can do, we'll do. So solidarity and thanks for everything that you've done.
Thank you.
It's all on the live stream, so people that have missed the meeting can...
I will, yeah. All right. For those who've just logged on, if they're watching at home or Facebook, you can see this. You can share the fringe. It's facebook. I can't read your writing, actually. Would you like to do it?
Basically, if you go to facebook.com/mirror/live, and it's also on the Unite page, you'll be able to share a video of what's happened today. If you think more people need to hear what's been spoken about, please do share it.
Thanks, thank you, Ros. And you can go on that handwriting course later on. I think it's because you type all the time, isn't it? But Steve, that fighting spirit throughout history has been so valuable in working people, and justice can be achieved. We can win. This campaign can be won, and there will be no justice until there is the truth. And Hillsborough was a way forward. I'm afraid those families had to wait so many decades. I hope you don't have to wait as long, but we can get there. I'm conscious of the time, and people have to go back to the conference. I would normally take questions, but we've only got a few minutes. So if you have a question, it'll be very brief, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Sorry, it's a question for Burnham. I want to say firstly, I think your energy and enthusiasm for these campaigns in this fight is something the country really, really needs right now. So it's fantastic to see. So would it be fair to say that the government has snubbed and at times actively hid away our senior healthcare professionals and our scientists in favour of their own agendas? And from a scientist, under your leadership, can you ensure that in the event of another healthcare crisis, we will be taken much more seriously than we were during COVID, and still are being during COVID, and placed much more prominently in the public eye to tackle misinformation and public uncertainty?
Thank you. And just before I answer that, Andy, I'll take the question from our female colleague at the back. Thank you.
Is the mic coming, Julia? Is the mic coming? Well, I know you have. We probably hear you in the conference hall.
Hey, shut
Yeah.
You better be careful, mate. I just want to raise the issue of PPE and how destructive not having any was to the communities. My daughter's a community nurse, and she was going into people's homes, old people's homes, who'd been sent home from the hospital. She'd got no PPE. They had to borrow a gown from the vets, and they had to use that gown for 2 people. And both them 2 people got COVID. Really seriously ill they was. It lasted for 3 months. And so, you know, when they tell us, because I did go to my new Tory MP, who told me that they'd got plenty of PPE. I told him they hadn't. He didn't believe me. And he kept on with that story all the time. And I think we need to raise that story. We need to tell people our old people were treated in homes. One of our homes had 9 people die in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
It's a disgrace.
Yeah, thank you. And final question from our colleague here. Could we just the mic down the front, please? Thank you. The lady in the grey here. Thank you. So,
Hi, can I just add that disabled people should be mentioned on this? The language that was used, and well, they're ill in a way, doesn't matter if they die. And 59% of people who have died have been disabled and totally ignored financially throughout the whole pandemic. So I'd just like to ask you, and on a personal note, my mother got COVID in a care home and she never mentally recovered from that because she didn't understand why she was locked in a room for weeks and weeks on her own with very little human contact.
right. Thank you, and sorry to ask for short answers to very serious questions. Andy, do you want to?
I will, thanks, Kevin. I'll give a quick answer to all three. So that was a learning that I had mid-swine flu, that it wasn't helping for politicians to be up front. It was better for everybody if it was more led by the experts and the clinicians. And that's basically what we did. And it did get better at that point. I remember it. You know, it wasn't going well. Kevin and his colleagues in the media would kind of, obviously, because you always bring in the agendas of, not Kevin, but, you know, anybody will write with the prism of the who's up or who's down in Westminster when you're talking about the politicians. Better just to take all of that stuff away from a pandemic and let it just be completely led independently by the clinicians, with politicians providing the support where needed. So absolutely would give you that assurance from my point of view. And the DPHs, the Directors of Public Health, they should have been listened to. Genuinely. A shout wrong as far as that. I was often going public with shouts that they were giving me, and I don't think they got one wrong. And it was always the case that the national decision was different from what the local Directors of Public Health were saying, and this is something that the inquiry really needs to look at. So completely agree with you. So, I mean, that's awful to hear, you know, what you were saying about, you know, the conditions in which your daughter had to work. Here's another thing that I didn't mention in my speech that I hope will be very much looked at by the inquiry. It's the planning phase needs looking at. I was told by friends of mine in the NHS that the date on PPE that was going out into the system was 2009-10, and that is because we replenished the stockpile as a Labour government before leaving government because of swine flu and what it had done to the stockpile. But there was a stockpile then, because that was sensible pandemic planning, which is what we did. And then we replenished the stockpile after the swine flu pandemic, and it was that PPE that was going out into the system. And I think it's really important that this inquiry holds them all to account, the Chancellors in that period, but the Health Secretaries as well, Lansley and particularly Hunt. Did he replenish that stockpile or not? And if not, why not? Because I can tell you all, the clear advice from the Department of Health when I was there is that although it's inconvenient and it's frustrating to have to spend money on something that no one ever sees, and that has got to be done in the national interest, and it wasn't done. And that led to the situation that your daughter found herself in, and there was obviously those poor elderly ladies. I mean, domiciliary care, we've not really touched on this today. There was a lot of focus on care homes. Domiciliary care workers were kind of completely ignored altogether. And there's another story there, isn't there, about social care, and anyway, but not got the time with Kevin today. And just, you make such an important point. We have a disabled people's panel in Greater Manchester. It was stood up actually just before the pandemic. And they asked me, could they do a survey of their members on the back of the first lockdown. And to be honest with you, I felt, well, I don't know, it was awful reading it when I understood how people have been living in that. It was a real shock to the system. And we had a big event where we made all the Greater Manchester system look at the findings from the survey, because the voices were, as you said, not being heard at all, not prominent. You know, the lack of any sign language at the Downing Street press briefing said it all, didn't it? The only country, I think, to do that. So again, on every level, these things were pointed out, but they weren't corrected. And that you can make a mistake in a pandemic, you know, because it's a rush and you're working at speed. But to have that mistake pointed out and still not correct it, that is the real culpability, I think. And there are many, many examples of that. But disabled people, as you rightly say, were hit probably harder than anybody else, and it's critical that the inquiry obviously looks into that.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
So, well, basically our campaign is working together with other organisations that are specifically targeted to certain areas. So we do have a cooperative relationship with an organisation that is concerned with the effect on people with disabilities, amongst other things. What our intention is that as we're sort of compiling the evidence for what we want to be in the terms of reference, that all of these other organisations are contributing their expertise into their area. So we're going to try to cover literally everything, and nothing is going to be considered to be a footnote. Everything is treated with the same equal importance and dignity, and that's really important to us as a campaign, because, like I said, this is looking to affect and save everybody, not specific people. So we are definitely 100% committed to making sure that people with disabilities are represented equally to everybody else.
Thank you. Sonia?
Yeah, I think a few questions there. I think about, the PPE. I think what was bizarre is that there was just this constant gaslighting to NHS workers. Like, it was obvious that we didn't have masks, we didn't have gowns, and yet we kept being told by politicians on the TV that it wasn't a problem. But I think the second thing about when we went into this pandemic in a very bad, we weren't in a good place at the start of this pandemic, and Mr. Hunt, who has been parading himself as Mr. Sensible these days, he is the one that oversaw the massive cuts to the NHS, the reduction in bed capacities, the closures of hospitals. I was one of those junior doctors that went on strike against Jeremy Hunt, and we were telling him then, if you listen to our protests, we were saying staff shortages are a real problem. We have no spare capacity. We won't be able to deal with a pandemic. And a pandemic was expected. It was high on the risk register. So I do think this inquiry needs to look at not just this government, but what the previous government did and how it left our NHS in a position where we were doomed to fail and we weren't going to be able to cope. I completely agree with everything that you said about, particularly the language. You're right, the language we used, COVID, people with comorbidities, the language. It's a disgusting language. And of course, most of us will have health problems at some point in our lives. And the idea that somehow makes you, that they can be sacrificed is pretty disgusting. And I think we need to really reflect on that as well, how all of us and how the media, the language that we use throughout this pandemic. And you're completely right. And I hope that we can learn about that as well.
Thank you. And Steve, the last word today from you, please.
Yeah, well, I'll echo the comments that have already been made about the disproportionate impact on disabled people. The majority of people that died, you're spot on, were disabled people for a variety of different reasons. And, part of the investigation into this, the inquiry into this, must be find an explanation for that and to put things right. Labour's got its position around National Care Service and doing all sorts of things that are going to be incredibly important as we move forward in investing money in our health service. And clawing back from 10 years of austerity politics, the economics of austerity and cuts to local services, community services, all of which were desperately needed during the course of the last 18 months, are desperately needed in any event, in normal circumstances. But many local authorities have found themselves in a position of not even being able to provide statutory services, let alone the essential services that are required during the course of a pandemic. I agree, Julia made the point about PPE, the investigation into PPE. It's not just about PPE, it's about the NHS supply chain and the privatisation of the supply chain. A contract was given to Unipart, that are better known for just-in-time delivery in the auto sector than just too late in the health service. And that's the reality of it. They got a contract on the basis that they'd save £4 million from that contract over a period of 4 years. Well, how did they do that? How were they going to do that? They emptied the shelves, they didn't replenish the shelves. That's what happened. That's why you got 10-year-old PPE being delivered to hospitals, well out of date.
Quality as well.
Bad quality PPE, absolutely. So that's the part of the investigation. The impact of 10 years of austerity politics is part of the investigation. It can't just be what happened during the course of, the last year or two of the pandemic itself. Sick pay is another huge problem. 2 million workers don't qualify for sick pay at all because they don't earn enough. They don't earn enough. Some of the most vulnerable people that travel from job to job to job, a couple of hours here, a couple of hours there, using public transport more so than any other form of transport to get between jobs, don't actually earn enough or are not employees and therefore don't qualify for even statutory sick pay at £67 a week. People making choices about whether they can afford to be sick, even though the government was saying you've got to do your national duty and stay at home. But they can't afford to stay at home if you're paying rent and you're putting food on the table and sick pay is at £67 a week, even if you qualify for it. So that whole question about how we treat working people with dignity and respect, and it was in Labour's paper actually, Angela raised it yesterday as part of that, you know, the fair wage strategy, and sick pay is a key part of that and making it accessible to everybody as a right. All workers, single class of worker. So there are lots and lots of things in this. Some we've got answers to, many we haven't, but certainly should be the subject of an investigation and the inquiry.
Yeah. Andy, you wanna...
Steve just prompted me with mentioning the National Care Service. I'm just going to put this out there. Should we resolve today that we need to use this conference to get the party to commit to a National Care Service, social care on NHS terms? Because if we had that and we had staff paid properly rather than poverty pay to look after other people's relatives, which is the current reality, and we'd have people equipped properly doing that incredible job of social care. This party should be committing to social care on NHS terms so that we can build them as one system in the 21st century. And I just plead with you all to use your voice and your influence this week to say to the party, that is where Labour should be coming out of this pandemic. It's a policy the public would support.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Andy. And as Steve said, this is a discussion that should be on the wider conference floor, because I think the Labour conference is like a festival of politics, and I think the most interesting parts are actually on the fringe, rather than some of the joined-up shouting you hear in the wall. All right, I'd just like to thank now Steve and Sonia and Andy and Ros, and of course Hannah and Matt, and best wishes, luck, solidarity in the campaign, because your campaign is all our campaigns, because it is in the public interest. And thank you to everybody for coming today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the week, indeed the rest of your lives. Thank you.